Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I was joking in the other room. I think this is our 37th annual Infrastructure Week event. We are deeply committed to the tradition. One of the things we believe is that Washington lacks for tradition, and it really is a pleasure that many of you were willing to join us, and I'm sure doing other events in town. So a year ago, I think we met with some considered hope that Congress and the administration would recognize the compelling security, economic, and political benefits of a major infrastructure program and put together the parameters of a comprehensive bill. I think today we are reminded both of the overwhelming fiscal and political logic of that idea and the fact that hope is not a strategy. So we persevere. Much like the nation's aging infrastructure, we are a resilient crowd here at the BPC, with an eye towards the next opportunity, which we really do believe will be in early 2019. And we are continuing and redoubling our efforts around what we believe is just the kind of obvious three-part strategy to get this done. And that is to have a renewed federal commitment to sustain funding, to ease and, in fact, inspire the path for private investors to help fill this funding gap, and to ensure that we have meaningful and, I emphasize, practical regulatory reform. The vehicle for the Bipartisan Policy Center's analysis and advocacy is our CEO Council on Infrastructure. It's a group, as some of you know, of corporate leaders from a wide variety of institutions, including pension funds and insurance and actual construction companies. We are very pleased to have two new members I would just like to acknowledge. Zurich has joined us. They are, of course, a leader in insurance and institutional investing. They also bring a really unique perspective on the challenges of engaging with the increased frequency and severity of natural disasters, which I personally believe is going to be one of the key motivators to bring the infrastructure debate back into an appropriately central political discussion. Also delighted that the Bank of Montreal has joined us. As I think all of you know, our friendly neighbors to the north are remarkable leaders when it comes to encouraging public-private partnerships, and there's a lot that our council is eager to learn from our Canadian friends, particularly if the Caps vanquish the Jets in the Stanley Cup. When it comes to innovation, though, I think we recognize that there is really no more creative and effective nation than Australia, which is pioneering a really significant raft of very interesting programs. And so we are honored today to be joined by His Excellency Joe Hockey, who is Australia's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Hockey has a long and distinguished career in public service. He entered the Parliament in 1996, where he served 17 years as a member representing North Sydney. In 2013, Ambassador Hockey was appointed to be Treasurer of the Commonwealth, with responsibility for both economic and fiscal policy, and also clearly had the opportunity to hone his diplomatic skills, serving as the chair of the G20 finance ministers, representing Australia at the IMF, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, APEC meetings. And so the ambassador really brings, I think, just that unique combination of fiscal and political insight, which of course is the crucible of getting infrastructure moving forward in both Australia and hopefully the rest of the world. So it is my pleasure to welcome the ambassador to share some thoughts. I'll then take the prerogative of asking a few questions, and we will then open it up to a broader discussion.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you so much, Jason. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And thank you so much for coming along this morning. The United States does a lot of great things. It is by far the world's most significant military power, spending more than the next 8 countries combined. It has the greatest intelligence gathering power in the world, the largest economy in the world. 40% of the world's R&D is spent here. 70% of the world's capital market transactions occur in US dollars. But your infrastructure is mediocre at best. At best. And there are a combination of factors that have caused that, and standing very much from the outside and very much as a commentator. So much of it is around a lack of government funding, a constraining, like a boa restrictor level of regulation, and Also, just elongated processes for environmental approvals, planning approvals, and sectoral political interests. Australia hasn't had the great fortune of the United States in having such enormous scale nor such deep pockets. So we've had to be innovative when it comes to infrastructure. Our country is the same size as the United States, but it has a population of Florida, around 24 million people. And yet, Australia today is enjoying its 27th consecutive year without a recession. 27 years without a recession, the longest continuous period of economic growth of any developed nation in world history. It's not an accident. We've had to be innovative, particularly in the face of living in the fastest growing region, not only in the world, the Asia Pacific, but in the history of humanity. And we compete. We have to compete in order to survive. And infrastructure is absolutely essential, not only to empower your people to be their innovative best, but it's absolutely essential to improve the productivity of your nation. Governments have traditionally bought growth. They've done it through tax cuts and fiscal stimulus. Central banks have done it through low interest rates. Those days are over. That's what I said to the G20 in 2014. I say it again in 2018 here in Washington. Governments and central banks can no longer buy growth. You have to earn growth, and the only way you can earn growth is through improving your productivity. And I can say to you emphatically and in an informed way that unless the United States spends an additional $2 trillion on infrastructure maintenance, $2 trillion on infrastructure maintenance over the next 7 years, your economic growth is going to drop from what it could be. And that starts to cost jobs, that starts to cost wealth, and certainly reduces your income. And it's not as if you haven't got competition. Over the next 15 years, China will be spending $40 trillion on infrastructure. And Asia alone will be spending multiples of that, from India to Indonesia, right across the Indo-Pacific. So the question for the United States is, how badly do you want to maintain your quality of life? How badly do you want to maintain your leadership of the world economy? Because if you don't spend money on infrastructure, and if you don't actually get the infrastructure built, you're going to start to fall behind. So from our perspective, we can't afford to do that in Australia. When I was a Treasurer in 2014, which is the equivalent of Secretary of the Treasury, I looked at the economy and said, wow, we've had a massive mining boom, construction boom, with companies like Chevron spending $80 billion building these massive gas plants across Australia. Australia today is the largest exporter of liquid gas in the world. We're the biggest exporter of coal in the world, biggest reserves of uranium in the world, biggest exporter of iron ore in the world. But all of those things represent only around 8% of our economy. Agriculture, beef, wheat, what we're famous for, represents around 3% of our economy. So we needed to lift our consumer economy. We needed to lift our service economy. Only by rolling out new broadband, better infrastructure in water and electricity, in telecommunications and so on, were we going to ever get anywhere near competing with Asia. And we had to be innovative. Because like every other government in the world, we spent a tremendous amount of money during the global financial crisis. And Australia, even though when it went into the global financial crisis, it had no government debt. We wiped out government debt in 2007, and we actually started saving significant amounts of money in a sovereign wealth fund. No deficits. And of course, we spent it making sure we didn't go into recession during the global financial crisis. But now, the question for me in 2014 was, what are we going to do to keep the economy growing, to get productivity going? There's a massive amount of private sector capital. Australia has around the 4th largest amount of pension funds in the world held in the private sector, 4th to 5th. So how are we going to get private sector money into infrastructure that was going to lift productivity? Because government, at the end of the day, didn't have enough money to do it. And I looked around the state governments and the county government equivalents and saw that they still owned businesses. Businesses that paid no tax to me, businesses that competed with the private sector, businesses that were in many ways inefficiently run. They paid poor shareholder returns to the states and counties that own them. And I said, well, I will give you an incentive to lease or sell those businesses and take all of the money and put it into new infrastructure. And I'll create a pool of money, and that pool of money will be a bonus payment to you if you take the political pain of doing it. And I'm not going to dictate what assets you lease. I'm not going to dictate what infrastructure you build, but I need cranes. I need tunnel boring machines. I need productivity enhancing infrastructure, and I need it fast. As a result, because of politics, less than half the states took it up, but the biggest state, thank God, did. New South Wales, which has Sydney as its capital, is one of the fastest, in fact, is the fastest growing state in Australia today. In fact, Sydney has more tunnel boring machines operating, around 48 tunnel boring machines under the city, and has more operational cranes than almost any other city in the world today. Today, Australia is spending more on transport infrastructure than any other country in the world. We're the 13th biggest economy in the world, but we're spending more on transport infrastructure than any other country in the world. And there's still more to be done because we have to compete. We can't be the lazy brown dog. We need to be there, and we need to be able to compete, particularly with the fastest growing region in the world. So providing innovative solutions to the infrastructure backlog is the only way you are going to get things built. And at the end of the day, Washington doesn't build anything. In Australia, our national capital is Canberra. I recognise Canberra doesn't build anything. Right? We haven't got a huge workforce of builders and constructors, and at the end of the day, we have to deal with state, planning legislation and state environmental legislation, and if we build one-off infrastructure, who knows whether it'll actually meld up properly with all the other infrastructure that needs to support it. If you build a railway line, you've got to have an intermodal. If you have an intermodal, you've got to have an airport nearby. If you have an airport nearby, you need to have access to a port. The arm's connected to the body that's connected to the leg. And the only way to do infrastructure is to do it in an integrated way, to have a plan. So each state in Australia, by its own volition, as well as the federal government, set up infrastructure bodies. In the case of Australia, Infrastructure Australia. In the case of New South Wales, Infrastructure New South Wales, Infrastructure Victoria. Each state set up its planning body. It put down the priority list of infrastructure and said these are the independent, analysed priorities for infrastructure. This is what we need first, because we need to build this in order to then go and build this second tier and the third tier. And at the end of the day, we had to make the hard political decision. I'm telling you, it's hard. Not only to lease assets, and lease assets where you would even sell some assets like electricity poles and wires to foreign buyers. But our politicians were able to convince, not always, but they were able to, in many cases, successfully convince the public that the poles and wires are not going to be picked up by an investor out of Japan and China and carried over there. You're still going to get your poles and wires, but actually you're also going to get this new road that gets you to work 20 minutes faster. Or you're going to get this brand new railway that is going to get you to work faster or get you around town. Or it's going to reduce the cost of you doing business. Or you're going to get a faster internet. and you actually sell the positives whilst convincing the people that whatever sacrifice you made to get the positive is worth it. And you know what? The voters come with you. As long as they can see that you're not wasting the money, as long as they can see that the asset is not going to go away, as long as they can see that they're going to benefit. And that's hard politics. And trust me, it's not popular, but it's right. And at the end of the day, good policy is good politics. Good policy is good politics. It's not always a simple solution. Sometimes businesses don't do well in infrastructure. Nothing, could be better illustrate that than the Indiana Toll Road, where the first purchaser and builder went broke. The Sydney Harbour Tunnel, Cross City Tunnel in Sydney, went broke twice, I think. And commuters didn't notice any change at all. It was the banks that took a haircut, mainly because the intermediaries massively overestimated the amount of traffic. So be it. If the banks take a hit, do you think the electorate is really concerned? Do you think the commuters are really concerned? Only if prices go up substantially. But when governments get the formula right at the very beginning and have a proper pricing formula and have price monitoring and, if necessary, price control mechanisms, you can actually protect the consumer and get the asset. For example, we leased our airports years ago. We put in place an independent price monitor. Airports are basically, from an airline perspective, a runway and fuel. And then the rest of the airport is basically a big shopping centre with a car park. That's what they are. They're land plays. Nothing particularly sophisticated about them at all. So if you can say to the airlines, okay, we're going to make sure that you have some price control over aviation gas, and you're going to have price control over landing fees, leave the rest to us, they'll say fantastic. And at the end of the day, you can capture the value. You can capture the value of what the airport does, but most importantly, the vendor of the airport actually has the money to go and be able to build all the other infrastructure that the airport would normally support, such as an intermodal, such as potentially a new port, such as better electricity supply, more reliable electricity supply, and so on. So it's not just Australia that's ahead of the US, it's Korea, it's Japan, it's Germany, it's the United Kingdom, it's New Zealand, it's a range of different countries, because they've had to do it. Because we've gone down the path before of governments not having enough money. We've gone down the path before of the pain of leasing assets, selling assets, privatising assets. Margaret Thatcher started it, really, in Britain, turning Britain around for the long term. So there's a challenge out there for the United States. Is it going to actually invest in infrastructure? Is it actually going to build infrastructure just to maintain the quality of life of the people of the United States today? Just to maintain it. That's a $2 trillion commitment, much larger than anything that's ever been on the table here for infrastructure before. And if you want to improve, if you want to grow, then you have to spend more and you have to get the infrastructure going fast. Thanks very much.
Well, that was really very refreshing, because I think there's nothing more valuable than tough. No, nothing more valuable than tough love from a true friend. Though I do have to say, when you were, as I was wallowing in our $20 trillion debt, and you were talking about being debt-free through the recession, I did feel a little braggy, but I understand. So
it was painful.
No, look, credits to you as the Secretary of the Treasury for that one. I have a handful of questions, but I really want to maybe open it up first to the audience. We have some fleet-footed mic runners, and if there's more than a 10-second pause, I will jump in with my own. But please just let us know who you are and wait for a mic.
Thank you, Rick Rybeck with Just Economics. Thanks very much for the presentation. I'm very curious in terms of how we fund infrastructure. It seems to me, I don't know about this story in Australia, but in this country, people who own land next to a highway interchange, next to a transit stop, their land goes way up in value, and they get a huge windfall from public infrastructure. Yet somehow our infrastructure authorities are poor, claim to be impoverished. I'm wondering to what extent you think that landowners should contribute in proportion to the benefit they receive, sort of like a user fee, or in this case it would be like a public infrastructure access fee, in order to compensate the public for the value that they're receiving from the public.
Well, the motivation for, you could call that a betterment tax, you could call it a, trying to value capture the enormous benefits. And look, railways are the best example. You build a railway through the city, as we did in the middle of Sydney, all of a sudden the air rights become incredibly valuable as, you build a railway station and all the apartment blocks going up, massive amount of captured value for the developer. Governments have the capacity to have a betterment tax, but you've got to be careful not to be greedy. I mean, it's a fine line. We're building a new second airport in Sydney, and one of the owners of the airport, it was a dairy farming community around there, and they've become billionaires overnight, right? Good luck to them. At the end of the day, the government's zoning all around that new airport industrial, and they've got a windfall, but the money stays in the community in one form or another. So, it can be part of the overall model that you say, well, there's going to be, and I know Seattle has just introduced a new tax, highly contentious tax in relation to, effectively a betterment tax on Seattle citizens because of the emergence of Amazon and so on. You can do it, and I wouldn't rule that out. I'm not someone in favour of new taxes or more taxes, but you can share the value capture, and it comes down to whether you give them the zoning they need, because it's no use having single floor residential zoning around an airport. They will get more value if you zone it industrial. So when you zone it industrial, and I'm talking about you as the county or the city, if you zone it industrial, you say, well, we've got a betterment tax. You have to give us a whole value capture out of that.
I think we have a couple of questions in this row right here.
Thank you. I'm Susan Irving at GAO. In this country, first of all, we don't own a lot of the things that other countries have since privatized. So we already don't own the electric utility system or poles or the airports. But second of all, traditionally P3s in this country have been a way to share value but leave all the risk to the government. So when we do things, famously the Boeing airplane tanker and things like that, all the risk stays with the federal government. And some of the states have been badly designed that too. So how is it we design, if we're going to do it in this country, we're going to have to pay real attention to, given our reluctance to admit we're spending a lot of money, we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to how we protect the risk of the government.
Yeah.
Because often what happens is then you go to these things and people push the P3 and say, and don't worry about your interest costs, because you can deduct that, meaning the feds will pay it.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things there. Firstly, I think there's about $1 trillion of assets that are owned by government in the United States. Almost every airport. Oh, not just the feds, but actually the feds have a tremendous amount of defence land for a start. And but housing stock. For example, the housing stock of I think it's the Army is leased out for private sector management, but not for the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines. But it varies. But every airport in America is virtually owned by a county or a city, which is absurd to anyone in Europe or Australia or, in fact, many other countries. So there's probably $1 trillion that could be leased out. And you're absolutely right. Some countries, the United States electricity assets might be private sector, but there's other assets that are clearly government owned that we don't have. So it cuts both ways. And on the second point, what was the
risk stays with the government.
Oh yeah, sure. No, the risk stays with the government. Sure.
A lot of the Army private housing, all the risk is with the federal government.
Well, no. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Sure. it comes down to how you, and this is the big challenge in the United States because ownership of assets is so widely dispersed, and also because you have so many levels of government. And in Australia we have, really two levels of government with also some city governments. What you've got to do is set up a team of experts that are experts in selling assets, leasing assets, and in issuing P3s. Because, if big private sector providers come along and negotiate with small towns on a P3, 9 times out of 10 they'll look at it as a one-off transaction and walk off. And you end up in tears like the Chicago parking meters, where there was a really bad transaction. And why? Because it was a bad vendor sale, because they didn't get proper advice. And the bottom line is you've got to set up teams of experts. So one of the things we did was I hosted the National Governors Association and brought over all the premiers of both political persuasions from Australia. And we've offered to partner our expertise with state governors on how to formulate the contracts for the leasing of assets or contracts for P3s, so that you're not gouged, so that you do have a regulatory environment, so that the state or the county or the city doesn't lose control of the asset. At the end of the day, you don't have to pass all control to the private sector, but you can put in place safety mechanisms that ensure that you get political coverage and that it doesn't go wrong. You can do it. At the end of the day, every bit of infrastructure in a city is going to be a risk for the city. It's the same everywhere.
Time for a couple more questions. I think sir right next door.
Ambassador, thanks for your comments. Dave Ramaswamy, Indus Latin Ventures. I lived for a while in Sydney North Shore, and I must say it's like truly resort living. My
That's
question,
because I was the representative for that area.
so Ambassador,
Not quite, just true.
my question is related to two things. One is what you mentioned, the private versus public, and how do you bridge the trust deficit in terms of giving away the family jewels to private players. And relatedly, there's a lot of overseas capital, both in the sovereign side as well as on pension funds. So especially in Australia, there's a lot of Chinese sovereign investment into Australian assets, at least on the farming side, the agriculture side, which is a real estate play. So the question is, how do you partner with smart capital to invest in P3s? Thank you.
Well, you can pick and choose who invests. In fact, the United States is by far the biggest investor in Australia. Even though China is our biggest trading partner, the US is the biggest investor by far in Australia. In fact, China's number 5. So number 2 is Britain, number 3 is Japan, number 4 is Korea, and number 5 is China. It's not that China isn't increasing, of course it is. So you can be selective about how you do it. How do you build trust? 80% of the toll roads in America are owned by government. 80%. It's kind of weird. You've got to work really hard at changing the mindset of your community. I reflect when I get on a plane that you trust the private sector to build a tin can that you're going to fly in at 30,000 feet. You trust the private sector to make the food that you eat and feed your children. You trust the private sector to build the house, to build a car that you travel at extraordinary speeds at. Yet you don't trust them to run an airport, which is a shopping centre. Go figure. You don't trust them to build a tunnel to New York, or a port. And yet, in many cases, people are actually trusting them to provide private security to their families. So it's really about trying to contextualise what you're doing. Government isn't walking away from responsibility. Government's actually trying to help make life easier for you. And, you've got to build that level of trust. Trust is really hard in politics everywhere in the world at the moment. It's probably why I'm here in the United States after 20 years in politics in Australia. Maybe at the end of the day, people just say, well, enough, right? Politicians can't do it. But,
Maybe we need a swap. I mean, I think we all want to go to Australia based on your presentation.
No, I don't want to pretend everything's perfect in Australia at all. I mean, America is a great country. America has been great, is great, and will continue to be great. Trust me, as an outside observer.
Final question on the aisle.
Yes, ma'am.
First of all, let me just correct two things.
Sure.
The Navy and the Air Force have also privatized their housing, so that all of the services have 200,000 units. And to take issue with what Susan Irving said, the government has taken the risk. That's how the Department of Defense was able to get permission to privatize housing. If military families do not choose to live, no, I'm saying I'm sorry, I misspoke. The private sector took the risk in that one. That's how the department got the permission to do that. If military families have their choice of living in town or on the base, the privatized housing developers have to compete to get families to live there.
I was referring to base housing, which is managed by...
No, I am too.
And Lend-Lease, which is an Australian company, actually manages... I don't want to get in an argument, but I'll just put a submission to the Secretary of Navy.
It's even more successful than you realize. It's all three services have done it, and the private sector took the risk, contrary to what Susan said. But I want to just, I think our fundamental problem in this country is that good policy does not make good politics. By and large, good policy means that you are doing things that create benefits, diffuse benefits for large numbers of people, but impose some cost on narrow groups, and that makes for bad politics. We just failed once again to privatize our air traffic control system, something that you in New Zealand did 20 or 30 years ago. And it's because of very narrow interest groups, private pilots, and corporate jets. So,
well, I started working on privatisation in 1992. So, went and studied it in Britain after the experience of Margaret Thatcher. And there are many, many different models. There's many different models associated with leasing and privatisation. It's what works best for the community, and you've got to be flexible. For example, I sold a government state bank, and people said, my God, the state bank is, the state bank. You can't sell the state bank. It was a painful process, but we excluded the major banks from purchasing it. We just excluded them. We said, look, we're not going to sell it to any of the big major banks. And we'd prefer to have an initial public offer, but at the end of the day, we sold it to a fund manager that then started to go into banking for the first time and created competition. There are many, many different models associated with what you do. But you can't be too greedy as a vendor for a government. That's the point. If the government gets greedy and doesn't leave anything on the table, then you pay a much bigger price. So we had an initial public offer of a major insurance company. And it was the biggest insurer in Australia at the time to be publicly listed on the stock market. I convinced our governor that we had to have a 10% premium for all those mums and dads investing. Australia became the largest per capita shareholding nation in the world and followed on from the lead of Great Britain in helping to give people an incentive to buy into the assets. And the third big area of opportunity is to give the workers something. Because a lot of workers in the public sector working at the airports or in utilities or on the buses or on the trains, whatever the case might be, they feel as though they haven't got a sense of ownership. They've got a sense of pride, but they haven't got a sense of ownership. And so what we did was have big incentive programs. Even if they were majority purchased by private sector, we'd provide incentive shares to the workers. And it's worth giving the workers a premium to help them to come along in the process, rather than simply, to create fear amongst the workers that they're going to be worse off under private ownership. So, in 15 minutes, I'm unable to go through the details. And I generalised, but I disagree. So, over to you. I don't want to please don't read me as an interloper coming in and giving you a lecture.
The headline is "America Absurd." I got that down.
So it's not absurd. It's just the microcosm of infrastructure.
So let me close first with recognizing that kind of the coin of our realm is the constructive collision of ideas, and it's really terrific that we had the chance for a little of that today. We have a great panel, and then we have Congressman Graves coming. So I guess I'd just like to thank you for being both a great ambassador to the nation of Australia, but also an incredible ambassador for innovation and infrastructure. I really believe that what you were able to share with us, if we could find ways to capture that, and there are very few nations that our Congress actually is willing to follow, because we do have this sense of our own ego and exceptionalism. And I think what you in Australia and Canada...
To their great credit, they've asked, you know, and Chairman Bill Schuster came to Australia, brought a delegation to Australia of congressional representatives, and Secretary Chow, Vice President Pence, Gary Cohn. I mean, I've been interacting with all of them, but not pretending that the Australian model is perfect. Trust me, it's not. I mean, I'll tell you it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. But, you know, my dad always said to me, there's two ways you can go in life. You can either learn pain or you can feel pain. And he said, you're going to have to work out, son, how it goes, right? And I'd rather learn from everyone else's experiences and then try and make the best of it than go down the painful route of repeating everyone's mistakes. So we're just offering free, gratuitous advice.
We tend to have an alternative view, but really want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you.